The gunshots echoed through the quiet dawn like thunder, jolting Josephine Harlow from her restless sleep. She sat upright on her thin straw mattress, her heart hammering wildly in her chest, scarred hands instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath her pillow. 5 years at the Blackwater mining camp had taught her that safety was never guaranteed, especially for a woman with no family and no protection. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving landscape of Montana Territory showed no mercy to those who couldn't defend themselves. Josephine had learned that lesson the hard way when she'd been sold to the mining company to pay off her late father's debts. At 23, she'd spent what should have been the best years of her young life breaking rocks, hauling ore, and enduring the harsh conditions that had left her hands a patchwork of scars and calluses. More gunfire erupted, closer now. Josephine crept to the small window of her shack, careful not to be seen. In the distance, she could make out riders, not the usual mining company guards, but different men. Raiders, perhaps, or maybe. Everyone out, we're shutting this place down, a deep voice boomed. Hope, an emotion Josephine had almost forgotten, flickered to life. The mining camp was illegal, everyone knew it, using forced labor to extract silver from the mountainside. Rumors had circulated for months that the federal marshal was investigating, but the company had powerful friends. She grabbed the small bundle containing her few possessions and slipped outside. The scene before her was chaos. Men on horseback were rounding up the guards, while others broke the chains of the workers. One rider in particular caught her eye, tall and broad-shouldered, with a star pinned to his vest. Not a marshal's badge, but a sheriff's. As she watched, mesmerized by the prospect of freedom, a guard broke free from his captors. He spotted Josephine and lunged for her, seeing her as leverage. "Stay back or she dies," he shouted, pressing a knife to her throat. The tall sheriff turned, his blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "Let her go," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's over, Daniels, the camp is done." "Not until I get safe passage out of here," the guard snarled, pressing the knife harder against Josephine's skin. The sheriff dismounted in one fluid motion, his hand hovering near his holster. "That's not happening. You've got 3 seconds to release that woman, or what?" The guard challenged, "Or I put a bullet between your eyes." Time seemed to slow as Josephine felt the guard's grip falter slightly. She hadn't survived 5 years of hell by being helpless. With one swift movement, she drove her elbow into the guard's ribs and twisted away, her scarred hands scraping against the knife as she pushed it away. The guard howled and stumbled backward. Before he could recover, the sheriff's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. Josephine stood there, blood trickling from a fresh cut on her palm, breathing heavily as she watched the guard being hauled away. The sheriff turned to her, concern etched on his weather-worn face. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, tipping his hat back to reveal sun-lightened brown hair. "Nothing I haven't endured before," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. Speaking to men as equals wasn't something she'd been allowed to do for years. He nodded, studying her with those intense blue eyes. "I'm Sheriff Zachary Blackburn of Hecla. We've been working to shut this place down for months." "Josephine Harlow," she offered, suddenly aware of her ragged appearance, the dirt-stained clothes, the matted hair, and especially her hands, which she instinctively hid behind her back. The sheriff's gaze followed the movement, but he said nothing about it. "Miss Harlow, you and the others are free now. We've arranged transport to Hecla for anyone who needs it. Freedom." The word seemed foreign, almost frightening after so long. "What's in Hecla for someone like me?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "A chance," he said simply. "That's more than you had an hour ago." Josephine looked around at the mining camp that had been her prison. Other workers were gathering what few possessions they had, their faces showing the same mix of disbelief and caution that she felt. Some had been there longer than she had. Others had arrived more recently. All bore the marks of their captivity in some form. "A chance," she repeated, testing the word. "I suppose that's worth something." Sheriff Blackburn offered a small, genuine smile that transformed his stern features. "It's worth everything, Miss Harlow. Now let me see that hand of yours." Before she could protest, he had taken her injured hand in his. examining the fresh cut with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his powerful presence. Josephine felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her at his touch, the first kind contact she'd experienced in years. "You'll need this cleaned and wrapped," he said, releasing her hand and reaching into his saddlebag for a clean handkerchief. "Here." As she accepted the cloth, their fingers brushed, and for a fleeting moment, Josephine allowed herself to wonder what life in Hecla might hold. 3 days later, Josephine stood on the main street of Hecla, Montana Territory, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The small mining town was bustling with activity, merchants calling out their wares, children darting between buildings, and horses tied to hitching posts along the wooden sidewalks. After the isolation of the camp, the noise and energy were overwhelming. The town council had arranged temporary housing for the freed workers in various establishments. Josephine had been placed at Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with actual glass windows and real beds with feather mattresses. The older woman had taken one look at Josephine's state and immediately ordered a hot bath, clean clothes, and a proper meal. Now, wearing a simple brown dress borrowed from Mrs. Sullivan's daughter with her dark hair washed and braided, Josephine felt almost human again. Almost. The scars on her hands remained, visible reminders of what she'd endured. She tugged at the sleeves of her dress, trying to cover them as she made her way to the general store. The town council had also provided each freed worker with a small stipend to purchase necessities. Josephine clutched the few dollars in her pocket, overwhelmed by the prospect of actually choosing what she needed rather than having everything dictated to her. As she approached the general store, she noticed Sheriff Blackburn exiting the telegraph office across the street. He spotted her immediately, and a smile crossed his face as he made his way toward her. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, awkwardly smoothing her skirts. "Mrs. Sullivan has been very kind." "She's a good woman," he agreed. "How are you finding Hecla?" Josephine glanced around at the busy street. "It's different. I'm not sure I remember how to be around so many people." Something in her words made his expression soften. "It takes time, but you'll adjust, may I?" he asked, gesturing to the general store. She nodded, and they walked the remaining distance together. Inside, the store was filled with goods of every description: fabrics, tools, food, medicines, and luxuries that Josephine had almost forgotten existed. She felt momentarily paralyzed by the options. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Sheriff Blackburn asked, noting her hesitation. "Gloves," she said without thinking. "I need gloves." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He didn't comment, but simply led her to a display of women's accessories, where several pairs of gloves were arranged. Josephine selected a pair of sturdy cotton gloves, practical rather than decorative. When she went to pay, the sheriff surprised her by adding a second pair, finer ones made of soft leather. "Sheriff, I can't accept. Consider it a welcome to Hecla," he said firmly, already paying the shopkeeper. "And please, when I'm not on official business, it's Zachary or Zach." The kindness in his gesture brought a lump to her throat. "Thank you, Zachary." As they exited the store, he paused. "Miss Harlow, I'm hosting a small gathering at my home this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just a few friends and some good food. Would you consider attending? It might help you get acquainted with some folks in town." The invitation caught her off guard. I don't know if I'd be good company," she said honestly. "I think you'd be excellent company," he countered, "but I understand if it's too soon." Josephine looked up at him, this man who had ridden into her nightmare and brought it to an end, who continued to show her kindness without expectation. Something inside her, a part she thought long dead, stirred with curiosity about him. "I'll come," she decided. His smile was worth the nervousness her acceptance triggered. "Wonderful. My place is just past the church, the house with the blue door, around 6. "I'll be there," she promised. As they parted ways, Josephine slipped on the cotton gloves, concealing the web of scars that told her story. She wasn't ready to share that story, not with the town, and certainly not with the handsome sheriff who seemed to see more in her than she saw in herself. But for the first time in years, she felt something other than dread when thinking about the future. It wasn't quite hope, she wasn't ready for that yet, but it was possibility. And for now, that was enough. Saturday arrived with unexpected speed. Josephine stood before the small mirror in her room at the boarding house, scrutinizing her appearance. Mrs. Sullivan had loaned her a modest navy blue dress with white lace at the collar and cuffs. It was the nicest thing she'd worn in years, and she felt both grateful and uncomfortable in it. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Sullivan said from the doorway, "though you might want to wear your hair down. It frames your face so prettily." Josephine touched her tightly braided hair self-consciously. "I'm more comfortable with it up," she said quietly. Having her hair loose made her feel vulnerable, exposed. The older woman nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. But take this," she added, offering a small blue ribbon. "A little touch of color never hurts." Accepting the ribbon with gloved hands, Josephine tied it around the end of her braid. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, for everything." "Nonsense. Having you here has been a blessing." This old house needed some youth in it. She smiled warmly. "Now, don't keep the sheriff waiting." As Josephine made her way through town toward the house with the blue door, she felt eyes on her. The residents of Hecla knew where she and the others had come from. Some were kind, offering sympathetic smiles. Others were merely curious, while a few looked at her with suspicion, as if the taint of the camp might somehow infect their town. Sheriff Blackburn's house was modest but well-maintained, with a small porch adorned with potted plants. Light and laughter spilled from the windows. Josephine hesitated at the gate, her courage faltering. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Before she could retreat, the front door opened and Zachary stepped out. He wore no badge tonight, just a clean white shirt with a vest and dark trousers. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, caught the evening light, revealing streaks of gold among the brown. "I thought I heard someone," he said, smiling as he came down the steps. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't," she admitted. He studied her face, reading her apprehension. "Too many people," she nodded, grateful for his perception. "How about we sit out here for a bit first?" he suggested, gesturing to the porch. "Get you accustomed to the noise before diving in." Relief washed over her. "I'd like that." They settled on the porch swing, a respectable distance between them. From inside came the sounds of conversation and occasional laughter. "How have you been settling in?" Zachary asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Better than expected," she replied. "Mrs. Sullivan found me work at the dressmaker's shop. I start Monday." His face brightened. "That's wonderful news. It's simple work, cleaning up, organizing supplies, but it's a start." She flexed her gloved hands in her lap, "Though I'm not sure how much sewing I'll be able to do." Zachary's gaze fell to her hands. "May I?" he asked, extending his own. After a moment's hesitation, Josephine placed one of her gloved hands in his. With careful movements, he slipped off the glove, revealing the network of scars that crisscrossed her palm and fingers, some white with age, others still pink and raised. She expected him to recoil, but instead he traced one of the scars with his thumb, his touch feather light. "This wasn't just mining work," he said, his voice low and tight with controlled anger. "No," she agreed, seeing no point in lying. "The overseer believed in creative punishments." His jaw clenched, but his touch remained gentle as he examined her hand. "I should have shut that place down sooner." "You shut it down, that's what matters." He met her eyes, his own filled with a mixture of regret and admiration. "You survived, that's what matters." Before she could respond, the front door opened and a woman called out, "Zach, are you going to hide out here all evening or introduce us to your guest?" The moment broken, Zachary carefully replaced Josephine's glove. "Ready to brave the crowd?" he asked with a small smile. Drawing strength from his quiet support, Josephine nodded. "Ready." Inside, Zachary introduced her to a small gathering of friends: the town doctor and his wife, the school teacher, the blacksmith and his family, and a few others whose names blurred together in Josephine's nervous mind. To her surprise, the evening passed more pleasantly than she had anticipated. The conversation flowed easily, with no one pressing her for details about her past. Instead, they welcomed her into their discussions about town events, shared humorous stories, and treated her like any newcomer to their community. Throughout the evening, she caught Zachary watching her, his eyes reflecting satisfaction as she gradually relaxed among his friends. When he smiled at her from across the room, something fluttered in her chest, a sensation so long forgotten that she barely recognized it. Later, as guests began to depart, Josephine helped gather dishes despite Zachary's protests. "You're supposed to be a guest, not kitchen help," he said, following her into the small kitchen with an armload of plates. "I don't mind," she replied, rolling up her sleeves to wash the dishes. "It's nice to do something normal." He set down the plates and moved to her side, reaching for a towel to dry what she washed. They worked in companionable silence for a few moments before he spoke again. "Thank you for coming tonight. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming." She shook her head, hands immersed in the soapy water. "Your friends are kind. It's been a long time since I've been around people who—" She trailed off, unsure how to express what she meant. "Who see you as a person," he offered quietly. "Yes." The simple word carried the weight of years of dehumanization. As she handed him the last plate, her sleeve slipped back, revealing more scars extending up her wrist. She quickly pushed the sleeve down, but not before Zachary had seen. "Josephine," he said, setting down the towel, "you don't have to hide from me." "It's not a pleasant sight," she replied, trying to keep her voice light. "It's part of you," he countered. "And there's nothing about you I find unpleasant." His words struck her like a physical blow, unleashing emotions she had kept tightly controlled. To her horror, tears welled in her eyes. She turned away quickly, but Zachary gently caught her arm. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," she managed, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "It's just been a long time since someone—" She couldn't finish, the lump in her throat too large to speak around. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Without a word, he pulled her into a gentle embrace, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Josephine found herself leaning into his solid warmth, allowing herself this moment of comfort. "When I was a boy," Zachary said softly, his voice rumbling in his chest against her ear, "my father told me that scars are just stories written on skin. They tell where we've been, what we've survived." He drew back slightly to look at her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Your hands tell the story of your courage, Josephine. Never think otherwise." In that moment, standing in his kitchen with the evening light fading outside, Josephine felt something break free inside her, a small piece of the armor she had built around her heart. It terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange, tentative joy. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more. His smile told her he understood. The following weeks brought a gradual shift in Josephine's life. Her work at the dressmaker's shop proved to be a blessing. Mrs. Winters, the owner, was a practical woman who valued Josephine's meticulous nature and didn't fuss over her scarred hands. Instead, she assigned tasks that played to Josephine's strengths, organizing the shop, keeping the books, and eventually, helping customers select fabrics and patterns. "You've got an eye for color," Mrs. Winters remarked one afternoon as Josephine arranged a display of new ribbons. "Most wouldn't pair that burgundy with that particular shade of green, but it works beautifully." Josephine felt a flash of pride at the compliment. "My mother was a seamstress," she explained, the words coming easier than they once had. "Before she passed, she taught me about colors and textures." "Well, she taught you well," Mrs. Winters said with approval. "You're becoming indispensable around here." Such small validations helped rebuild Josephine's sense of self-worth. She began to hold her head higher when walking through town, to meet people's gazes rather than avoiding them, and even, occasionally, to smile. And then there was Zachary. True to his word, after the dinner party, he made no attempt to push Josephine beyond her comfort. Instead, he simply made himself a steady presence in her life, stopping by the shop to say hello, walking her back to the boarding house occasionally, or inviting her to join him for simple meals at the town's small restaurant. "People are talking," Mrs. Sullivan mentioned one evening as Josephine sat in the boarding house parlor, mending a tear in one of her dresses. "About what?" Josephine asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "About you and the sheriff," the older woman said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "It's not every day Zachary Blackburn escorts a lady to dinner 3 times in a fortnight." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "We're just friends." Mrs. Sullivan made a non-committal sound. "If you say so, dear." "Though I must say, friendship that puts that particular gleam in a man's eye usually doesn't stay just friendship for long. Before Josephine could formulate a response, a knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Sullivan rose to answer it, returning moments later with Zachary himself. "Sheriff Blackburn to see you," she announced with a pointed look at Josephine before tactfully withdrawing to the kitchen. Zachary stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Josephine assured him, setting aside her mending. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, He stepped further into the room. "I've been asked to deliver some documents to Helena next week. It's a 3-day journey there and back. I thought perhaps, if you'd like a change of scenery, you might accompany me." The invitation took her by surprise. "To Helena. The territorial capital has much to offer: shops, restaurants, a proper theater," he said, his words coming more quickly now. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you've been working exceptionally hard. You deserve a break." Josephine considered his offer. The thought of traveling alone with Zachary stirred conflicting emotions: nervous excitement, but also fear. Not of him, but of her own growing feelings. "People would talk," she said eventually. "People already talk," he replied with a wry smile. "But if it concerns you, we could ask Mrs. Sullivan to join us as a chaperone." The fact that he had considered her reputation touched Josephine deeply. It was yet another way he showed her respect, something she had been deprived of for so long. "I'd like that," she decided. "Though I wouldn't want to impose on Mrs. Sullivan." His face brightened. "I'll arrange everything. We'll leave Monday morning if that suits you." "It does." After he left, promising to return with details, Josephine remained in the parlor, a strange mix of anticipation and trepidation swirling within her. The journey would mean 3 days in close proximity to Zachary, 3 days during which her carefully maintained walls might crumble further. The question was whether she was ready to let them fall. Monday dawned clear and cool, a perfect late September day for travel. Zachary arrived at the boarding house promptly at 8, driving a comfortable covered wagon rather than riding horseback as he usually did. Mrs. Sullivan, bundled up against the morning chill, supervised the loading of their modest luggage. "It's been years since I've been to Helena," she remarked cheerfully. "I'm looking forward to visiting my sister while you two attend to your business." Josephine, wearing her new blue dress and a warm shawl purchased with her own earnings, felt a flutter of excitement as Zachary helped her onto the wagon seat. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she replied, adjusting her gloves, the fine leather ones he had given her that first day in the general store. They had become her favorite pair, not just for their quality but for the thoughtfulness they represented. With Mrs. Sullivan settled comfortably in the back of the wagon amongst the bags and supplies, they set off. The road to Helena wound through rolling hills and stretches of pine forest, following the path of the Missouri River for much of the journey. As they traveled, Zachary pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area, painting a vivid picture of the territory's history. "My father was one of the first lawmen in this region," he told her as they stopped to rest the horses around midday. "He believed in the law, but he also believed in justice, which aren't always the same thing." "Is that why you became a sheriff?" Josephine asked, helping Mrs. Sullivan spread a blanket for their picnic lunch. Zachary nodded, unhitching the horses to let them graze. "That, and I couldn't stand the thought of men like those who ran that mining camp operating freely. The territory is changing, becoming more civilized, but there are still plenty who think they can exploit others without consequence." His passion for justice was evident in his voice, and Josephine found herself drawn to it. In a world that had shown her so much cruelty, his unwavering moral compass was like a beacon. The journey continued pleasantly, with conversation flowing easily between the 3 travelers. Mrs. Sullivan regaled them with tales of Hecla's early days, when the town was nothing more than a collection of tents and rough cabins. "My late husband and I arrived in '62, she recalled. "He'd heard about the gold strikes and was determined to make our fortune. Never did find gold, but he found something better, a community worth building." As twilight approached, they reached a small roadside inn where Zachary had arranged for them to spend the night. The establishment was modest but clean, with separate rooms for the ladies and the sheriff. After a simple but satisfying dinner, Mrs. Sullivan excused herself, claiming fatigue from the journey. She gave Josephine a meaningful look before retiring, leaving her alone with Zachary in the inn's small common room. "She's not exactly subtle," Zachary noted with a chuckle once the older woman had gone. Josephine smiled, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "No, but her heart's in the right place. She cares about you." "She does," Josephine agreed. "It's strange how quickly some people have accepted me in Hecla. After the camp, I didn't expect." "Kindness," Zachary supplied when she trailed off. "Trust," she corrected. "I didn't expect to be trusted, to be seen as more than where I came from." He reached across the table, his hand open in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Josephine placed her gloved hand in his. "The people who matter see you for who you are," he said, his blue eyes intense in the lamplight. "I see you, Josephine." The directness of his gaze made her breath catch. She wanted to look away, but found she couldn't not when he was looking at her as if she were something precious. "And what do you see?" she whispered. "A woman of extraordinary strength. Someone who endured what would have broken most, yet still has the capacity for gentleness." His thumb traced the outline of her fingers through the leather glove. "Someone I think about far more than is probably wise." The admission hung between them, altering the air in the room. Josephine's heart beat so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I think about you too," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "But Zachary, I'm damaged, not just my hands," he shook his head. "Not damaged, scarred perhaps, but scars heal even if they don't disappear." "And if they don't heal?" she challenged, needing him to understand the depth of her fears. "If I'm never whole, then we work with what we have," he said simply. "I'm not asking for perfection, Josephine. I'm just asking for a chance." The earnestness in his voice threatened to undo her. For 5 years, she had existed rather than lived, focusing only on survival. The possibility of more of connection, of trust, of love seemed both miraculous and terrifying. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of hoping. Of believing this could be real." Understanding softened his features. "We have time," he assured her. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you not unless you want to." His patience touched her deeply. In a world that had often demanded everything from her without giving anything in return, his willingness to wait, to let her set the pace, was a gift beyond measure. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand before withdrawing her own. "We should probably follow Mrs. Sullivan's example and get some rest. It's a long journey tomorrow." Zachary nodded, rising from the table. "Good night, Josephine." As he walked her to her door, his presence solid and reassuring beside her, Josephine felt a certainty settle over her. Whatever happened in Helena, their relationship had shifted tonight. There would be no going back to mere friendship, not when both had acknowledged the current running between them. The question now was whether she would have the courage to follow where that current led. Helena, when they arrived the following evening, was everything Zachary had promised and more. As the territorial capital, it boasted amenities that Hecla could only dream of: brick buildings, gaslit streets, and an air of permanence that spoke of civilization firmly established. Mrs. Sullivan's sister, a widow named Margaret who ran a small but respectable hotel, welcomed them warmly. "Any friend of Abigail's is a friend of mine," she declared, showing them to comfortable rooms. "And Zachary Blackburn, it's been too long. Your father would be proud of the man you've become." The next morning, while Zachary attended to his official business at the territorial offices, Mrs. Sullivan and Margaret took Josephine shopping. For the first time since her rescue, Josephine found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of selecting fabrics and garments that appealed to her. "You need a proper dress for the theater tonight," Margaret insisted, guiding her toward a dress shop. "Zachary mentioned he'd be taking you and Abigail to the evening performance." Inside the shop, a rainbow of colors and textures awaited. Josephine found herself drawn to a dress of deep green satin with modest lace trim, elegant without being ostentatious. "That would suit you beautifully with your coloring," the shopkeeper noted. "Would you like to try it on?" Josephine hesitated, suddenly conscious of her scars. The dress had 3/4 sleeves that would expose her wrists and forearms. Mrs. Sullivan, sensing her discomfort, stepped forward. "Perhaps something with longer sleeves for the evening chill," the shopkeeper nodded, retrieving instead a dress in midnight blue with full-length sleeves. "This just arrived from St. Louis, the latest fashion." The dress fit as if made for her, the color bringing out the blue undertones in her dark hair and making her gray eyes appear almost silver. "Zachary won't know what hit him," Mrs. Sullivan murmured as Josephine emerged from the fitting room. Josephine blushed, but couldn't deny the little thrill that ran through her at the thought of Zachary's reaction. She purchased the dress, using money she had saved from her work at the dressmaker's shop, a small extravagance that represented her growing independence. Later that afternoon, as she prepared for the theater, Josephine faced a dilemma. The elegant dress called for equally elegant accessories, but her scarred hands made her hesitate to remove her gloves, even in the formal setting of the theater. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Sullivan entered, carrying a small package. "This just arrived for you," she said, handing it to Josephine. "From Zachary." Inside the package was a pair of opera gloves in the same midnight blue as her new dress, along with a note, "For a night at the theater. Wear them if you wish or don't. Either way, you'll be the most beautiful woman there." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to Josephine's eyes. He understood her insecurity, but didn't pressure her either way, simply provided an option and left the choice to her. When Zachary arrived to escort them to the theater, he stopped short at the sight of Josephine descending the hotel stairs. She wore the new dress, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than usual, with a few loose curls framing her face at Mrs. Sullivan's insistence. On her hands were the blue opera gloves, extending past her elbows to meet the dress sleeves. "Josephine," he breathed, his admiration evident. "You're stunning." The genuine awe in his voice made her feel truly beautiful for the first time in years. The theater itself was a revelation: plush seats, gilt decorations, and a stage set for a traveling company's performance of The Winter's Tale. Josephine, who had never seen professional theater, was entranced from the moment the curtain rose. During the intermission, Zachary led her and Mrs. Sullivan to the lobby for refreshments. As they stood discussing the first half of the performance, a voice called out from across the room, "Sheriff Blackburn, what a surprise." They turned to see a well-dressed couple approaching. The man, middle-aged and prosperous-looking, shook Zachary's hand warmly. "Judge Parker," Zachary greeted him. "Allow me to introduce Mrs. Abigail Sullivan and Miss Josephine Harlow of Hecla." The judge and his wife exchanged pleasantries, but Josephine noticed the woman's gaze lingering on her gloved hands with thinly veiled curiosity. "Miss Harlow," the judge said, his tone carefully casual, "the name sounds familiar. Were you perhaps involved in that mining camp business near Hecla?" The illegal operation Sheriff Blackburn shut down. Josephine felt her chest tighten. Of course, news of the camp would have reached Helena, especially among legal circles. Before she could respond, Zachary stepped slightly closer to her, his presence protective without being possessive. "Miss Harlow has been instrumental in providing testimony that helped bring the mining company executives to justice," he said smoothly. "Her courage has ensured others won't suffer similar exploitation." The way he reframed her experience not as a victim, but as a contributor to justice left Josephine momentarily speechless. "How commendable," Mrs. Parker said, though her expression suggested she found the topic distasteful. "And now you're visiting Helena." "Miss Harlow is considering opening a dress shop," Mrs. Sullivan interjected, the falsehood rolling easily off her tongue. "She has a remarkable eye for fashion, as you can see." She gestured to Josephine's elegant ensemble. The conversation shifted to safer topics, and soon the bell rang, signaling the end of intermission. As they returned to their seats, Josephine whispered to Zachary, "Thank you." He didn't pretend not to understand. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he replied quietly. "And everything to be proud of." During the second half of the performance, as the play's themes of redemption and forgiveness unfolded on stage, Josephine felt Zachary's hand find hers in the darkened theater. Through the fine fabric of her gloves, she could feel the warmth of his touch, solid and reassuring. She didn't pull away. The journey back to Hecla began early the following morning. They bid farewell to Margaret, loaded their purchases into the wagon, and set off as the sun was rising over the territorial capital. "Did you enjoy Helena?" Zachary asked as they traveled, the horses maintaining a steady pace along the familiar road. "Very much," Josephine replied truthfully. "The theater especially. We should go again sometime," he suggested, his tone casual but his eyes watching her reaction carefully. The implication of future journeys together made Josephine's heart skip. "I'd like that." From the back of the wagon came the sound of Mrs. Sullivan's gentle, snoring the early start having lulled her to sleep despite the wagon's rocking motion. Zachary chuckled. "Our chaperone is neglecting her duties." Josephine smiled, feeling more at ease with him than ever before. "I think we can be trusted, can we?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Because I must confess, Josephine, having you beside me like this makes trustworthy behavior increasingly difficult." The playful flirtation both thrilled and alarmed her. This was unfamiliar territory, not just his interest, but her own response to it. During her years at the camp, she had built walls around her heart, convinced that emotional connections were luxuries she could no longer afford. Now those walls were crumbling, and she wasn't sure whether to rebuild them or let them fall. "Zachary," she began, uncertain what she even wanted to say. "I'm not rushing you," he assured her quickly. "I just want you to know where I stand. My feelings for you aren't casual, Josephine." They've never been casual. The straightforward declaration hung between them, impossible to ignore or dismiss. In the clear morning light, with miles of road stretching before them, Josephine faced a crossroads more significant than any geographical junction. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve," she said finally. "My past is part of you, but it doesn't define you," he interrupted gently. "Just as my past is part of me, we all carry our histories, Josephine. The question is whether we let them determine our futures." His words struck a chord deep within her. For 5 years, she had been defined by her captivity, her identity reduced to that of a prisoner, a laborer, a victim. Even after her rescue, that definition had clung to her like a shadow. But here was Zachary, offering her the chance to be defined by something else, by connection, by possibility, by love. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. "I need time," she said honestly. "Time you shall have," he promised. "All that I ask is that you consider the possibility of us." The rest of the journey passed in comfortable conversation, with Mrs. Sullivan eventually waking to join in. They discussed Helena, the play, and the territorial news Zachary had gathered during his meetings. Beneath the ordinary exchange ran a current of something new, an acknowledgement of feelings expressed, and possibilities opened. By the time they reached Hecla late the following day, Josephine felt changed in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The journey had shown her glimpses of a life she had thought forever beyond her reach, one with beauty, culture, and most surprisingly, love. As Zachary helped her down from the wagon in front of Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, his hands strong and steady at her waist, Josephine made a decision. She would no longer let her past dictate her future. Whatever lay ahead with Zachary, she would face it with courage, the same courage he had recognized in her scarred hands from the beginning. The weeks following their return from Helena brought subtle but significant changes to Josephine's life in Hecla. Her work at the dressmaker's shop expanded to include actual sewing, as her hands proved more dexterous than either she or Mrs. Winters had anticipated. The scars limited her somewhat, but adaptation came naturally to someone who had survived what she had. More noticeable was her growing relationship with Zachary. Although he respected her need for time, he made no secret of his courtship. He began escorting her to church on Sundays, bringing her wildflowers he found on his patrols, and inviting her to dinner at least once a week. The town noticed, of course. Hecla was too small for such things to go unremarked, but to Josephine's surprise, the reaction was largely positive. Many, like Mrs. Sullivan, seemed pleased to see their sheriff finding happiness. A few raised eyebrows at her past, but Zachary's open support silenced most criticism. One crisp October afternoon, Josephine was organizing new fabric deliveries at the shop when the bell above the door jangled. Looking up, she was surprised to see Zachary entering, his expression more serious than usual. "Zachary, is everything all right? I need to speak with you," he said, glancing toward the back room where Mrs. Winters was working. "Is there somewhere private?" Concern tightened her chest. "Mrs. Winters won't mind if we step outside for a moment." Once outside, Zachary led her a short distance from the shop, his manner uncharacteristically tense. "What's wrong?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. Had something happened? Was he ill? Had he reconsidered his feelings for her? He took a deep breath. "I've received word from the U.S. Marshal. They've captured James Harrington." The name hit her like a physical blow. James Harrington, the mining company overseer who had been responsible for much of her suffering. The man whose cruelty had left many of the scars on her hands and arms. "Where?" she managed to ask, her mouth suddenly dry. "Wyoming territory. He'd fled there after the camp was shut down." Zachary watched her closely, gauging her reaction. "They're bringing him back to Montana for trial. He'll face charges of kidnapping, forced labor, and other abuses." Other abuses. The euphemism barely skimmed the surface of Harrington's cruelty. Josephine's mind filled with unwelcome memories: the crack of his whip, the burn of hot metal against skin, the endless demands for work beyond human endurance. "When?" she whispered. "The trial begins next month in Helena," Zachary said. "As sheriff, I'll be testifying. And they've asked if you would be willing to testify as well." The prospect of facing Harrington again, of speaking about what she had endured in a crowded courtroom, made her physically ill. She leaned against the wall of the building, suddenly lightheaded. "Josephine." Zachary's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this. There are other witnesses, other evidence, but the prosecutor believes your testimony would be particularly compelling." "Because of these?" she asked, holding up her scarred hands. "Because you survived," he corrected. "Because you can speak to what happened there in a way others might not be able to." Josephine closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The idea of revisiting that darkness, of pulling it into the light of a courtroom, terrified her. Yet a small voice inside reminded her of what Zachary had said in Helena about her testimony helping to ensure others wouldn't suffer similar exploitation. "Would it help?" she asked finally, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Would it really make a difference if I spoke?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Harrington deserves to face the consequences of his actions. Your words could help ensure that happens." Josephine thought of the other workers from the camp, some of whom had remained in Hecla while others had moved on. They all carried scars, visible or invisible. They all deserved justice. "I'll do it," she decided, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll testify." Relief and admiration mingled in Zachary's expression. "You're the bravest person I know, Josephine Harlow." She shook her head, denying the compliment. "I'm terrified." "That's what makes it brave," he said simply. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." He reached for her then, and she went willingly into his embrace. In the circle of his arms, with her face pressed against his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Josephine found the strength to face what lay ahead. "I'll be with you," Zachary murmured against her hair, "every step of the way." And in that moment, despite the dread of the coming trial, Josephine felt a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. Whatever happened in Helena, she wouldn't face it alone. The territorial courthouse in Helena was imposing a grand stone building with tall columns and an air of solemn authority. Josephine sat on a hard wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, waiting to be called to testify. Zachary had given his testimony earlier that morning, his clear, factual account laying out the conditions he had found at the mining camp, and the evidence gathered against Harrington and the company owners. Now it was her turn to speak about her personal experience: 5 years of systematic abuse and exploitation. "Miss Harlow," a court official approached. "They're ready for you." Josephine rose on shaky legs. She had chosen to wear a simple, modest dress for the occasion, nothing fancy but dignified. Her hair was neatly arranged, and her hands were bare. After much consideration, she had decided against wearing gloves. Let the jury see the evidence of what Harrington had done. As she entered the courtroom, the buzz of conversation died down. All eyes turned to her, the judge. the jury, the spectators, and finally, the man himself. James Harrington sat at the defense table, his once imposing frame somewhat diminished by jail time, but his eyes still cold and calculating as they fixed on her. Josephine faltered for a moment, the sight of him bringing back a flood of memories she had fought to suppress. Then she caught sight of Zachary, sitting in the front row, his expression a mixture of concern and unwavering support. Drawing strength from his presence, she continued forward and took her place in the witness stand. After being sworn in, the prosecutor approached. "Miss Harlow, could you please tell the court how you came to be at the Blackwater mining camp?" Taking a deep breath, Josephine began her story how her father's debts had led to her being essentially sold into servitude, how what was promised to be a year of work to pay off those debts had stretched into 5 years of captivity with no end in sight, and what were the conditions at the camp. The prosecutor continued. "We worked from dawn until dusk, sometimes longer," she replied, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Food was scarce and often spoiled. Shelter was inadequate. Many fell ill during winter months. Anyone who couldn't work was." She swallowed hard. "They were punished." "Punished how, Miss Harlow?" Josephine's gaze flickered to Harrington, who stared back impassively. Mr. Harrington had various methods. Withholding food was common, physical beatings, and for those he considered particularly troublesome there were other measures. "Could you elaborate on these other measures?" She held up her hands, displaying the web of scars for all to see. He believed in making examples. These came from hot metal, whiplashes, and— her voice faltered but then strengthened again. "And from being forced to break rocks until my hands bled, then being denied any medical treatment." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the judge's impassive expression flickered with concern. "And why were you selected for such treatment, Miss Harlow?" "I tried to help others when I could, sharing food, tending to the sick." Mr. Harrington considered this disruptive. The questioning continued for what felt like hours. Josephine described the daily reality of the camp, the exhaustion, the fear, the constant struggle for survival. Throughout her testimony, she kept her voice steady and her gaze direct, even when describing the most painful experiences. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney rose for cross-examination. His strategy quickly became apparent: to paint the workers as criminals or debtors who had agreed to their conditions, to minimize the abuse, to suggest that Josephine was exaggerating for sympathy. "These injuries to your hands," the attorney said dismissively, "couldn't they simply be the result of hard labor? Mining is dangerous work, after all." Josephine looked him directly in the eye. "Sir, I know the difference between an accident and deliberate cruelty. When Mr. Harrington held my hands against a hot stove because I gave my bread ration to a dying woman, that was not an accident." The attorney's composure slipped momentarily. "No further questions," he muttered, returning to his seat. As Josephine was dismissed from the witness stand, her legs trembled with relief and exhaustion. She had faced Harrington and spoken the truth of what she had endured. Whether it would be enough to convict him remained to be seen, but she had done her part. Outside the courtroom, Zachary was waiting. Without a word, he enfolded her in his arms, holding her as the emotional aftermath of her testimony washed over her. She didn't cry. She was too drained even for tears, but she clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world suddenly made of quicksand. "You did it," he murmured against her hair. "You were magnificent, Josephine, absolutely magnificent." For 3 more days, they remained in Helena as the trial continued. Other survivors testified, as did medical experts and officials who had investigated the camp. Finally, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Harrington was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, effectively a life sentence for a man of his age. As the guards led him away, his gaze found Josephine in the crowd. There was hatred there, but beneath it, something she had never seen in his eyes before: defeat. It was over. Justice, imperfect though it might be, had been served. As they began the journey back to Hecla the following morning, Josephine felt lighter than she had in years. A chapter of her life had closed, not erased, never that, but completed. The future stretched before her, no longer overshadowed by the specter of her past. "What are you thinking?" Zachary asked as their stagecoach rolled through the Montana countryside. Josephine looked at him, this man who had stood beside her through the darkest moments of facing her past, who had never flinched from her scars, either physical or emotional, who saw her courage when she could only see her fear. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that I'm ready." "Ready for what?" She smiled, her heart finally truly open. "For us." The November evening was crisp and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky above Hecla. Josephine stood on the porch of Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, wrapped in a warm shawl, waiting for Zachary to arrive for their dinner engagement. In the month since the trial, their courtship had progressed with a sweetness that still sometimes took Josephine by surprise. Zachary had been true to his word, never rushing her, allowing their relationship to unfold at a pace that felt comfortable to them both. Tonight, however, felt different. There was an anticipation in the air that made her pulse quicken. When Zachary appeared, he wasn't alone. His deputy, young Thomas Miller, accompanied him, leading 2 saddled horses. "I hope you don't mind a change of plans," Zachary said by way of greeting. "I thought we might have dinner somewhere special tonight." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "Somewhere that requires horses. Trust me," he asked, extending his hand. She placed her scarred hand in his without hesitation. "Always." With Thomas's help, Zachary assisted her onto one of the horses, a gentle mare that stood patiently as she arranged her skirts. Once she was settled, he mounted his own horse and they set off, leaving Thomas to return to his duties. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" Josephine asked as they rode side by side through town, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Zachary's smile was mysterious. "You'll see soon enough." They followed a trail that led up into the foothills overlooking Hecla. As they climbed higher, the town spread out below them, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing with a magnificent view of the valley and the mountains beyond. In the center of the clearing stood a table set for 2, complete with a white cloth, china plates, and candles waiting to be lit. Nearby, a small fire crackled, providing warmth against the evening chill. "Zachary," Josephine breathed, taking in the scene. "How did you?" "I had some help," he admitted, dismounting and coming to assist her. "Mrs. Sullivan packed the food, and Thomas helped me set up earlier today." As he lifted her down from the saddle, his hands lingering at her waist, Josephine felt a rush of affection so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. This man had thought of everything, creating a moment of beauty and privacy for them both. Once the horses were secured, Zachary lit the candles and uncovered dishes filled with all her favorite foods: roast chicken, fresh bread, autumn vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. He poured wine into crystal glasses that sparkled in the candlelight. "A toast," he said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," she echoed, touched by the simplicity and perfection of the sentiment. They ate beneath the stars, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic: the latest news from Helena, Mrs. Winters's plans to expand the dress shop, the upcoming Thanksgiving celebrations in town. It was ordinary in many ways, yet extraordinary in the setting and in the undercurrent of anticipation that hummed between them. When they had finished their meal and the remains of the pie, Zachary rose from his chair and extended his hand. "Walk with me." He led her to the edge of the clearing, where the view was most spectacular. The moon had risen, casting a silver glow over the landscape and illuminating the distant peaks with an almost ethereal light. "I've lived in Montana territory my whole life," Zachary said, his voice quiet in the night air. "I've seen its harshness and its beauty. I've watched it change and grow, but I never fully appreciated how magnificent it could be until I saw it through your eyes." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Josephine, you've shown me what true courage looks like. Not the kind that comes with a badge or a gun, but the kind that faces each day with hope, despite having every reason to despair." Her heart began to race as she realized where this was leading. "Zachary, please," he said gently. "Let me finish, or I might lose my nerve entirely." She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I love you, Josephine Harlow. I love your strength, your kindness, your resilience. I love the way you see beauty in the smallest things." I love how you've rebuilt your life piece by piece, never letting bitterness take root despite everything you've endured." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Dropping to one knee before her, he opened it to reveal a ring, a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds, elegant in its simplicity. "I want to build a life with you," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "To face whatever comes, good or bad, together. Will you marry me?" Josephine looked down at this man, this good, honorable man who had rescued her in more ways than one, who had never seen her as broken or damaged, but as whole and worthy of love, who kissed her scars and called them courage. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Zachary. I will marry you." Joy broke across his face like sunrise. Rising to his feet, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. When his lips met hers, Josephine felt as if every moment of her life, even the painful ones, had been leading to this perfect instant of happiness. Later, as they rode back to town beneath the starlit sky, the pearl on her finger catching the moonlight, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the darkness of the mining camp to the promise of a future with Zachary, it had been a path marked by both suffering and joy, loss and discovery. Her hands, scarred as they were, now held something precious, not just the reins of the horse or the ring on her finger, but the chance at a life filled with love. A life where her scars were not shameful marks to be hidden, but testaments to her survival, her strength, her courage. And that, Josephine realized with quiet certainty, was worth everything she had endured. Spring came to Hecla in a rush of green and gold, the harsh Montana winter giving way to new life almost overnight. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, creeks swollen with snowmelt rushed through the valleys, and the town itself seemed to awaken from its winter slumber. On the first truly warm Saturday in May 1879, Josephine Harlow became Josephine Blackburn in a ceremony that brought together the entire community. The church was decorated with early spring blossoms, their sweet fragrance filling the air as Josephine walked down the aisle toward Zachary. She wore a dress of ivory satin, its design a collaboration between herself and Mrs. Winter's elegant yet simple, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was arranged in loose curls, adorned with tiny white flowers, and her hands, visible to all as she carried a bouquet of wildflowers, bore their scars without shame. As she reached Zachary, resplendent in a new black suit with a silver vest, his eyes shone with such love that it took her breath away. He took her hands in his, thumbs gently caressing the ridged skin of her palms, a gesture that had become intimately familiar and deeply meaningful between them. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this community to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was traditional in most respects, but when it came time for the vows, Zachary and Josephine had chosen to speak their own words. "Josephine," Zachary said, his voice steady and clear for all to hear, "I promise to stand beside you in all of life's joys and sorrows, to honor your strength and support you in moments of weakness, to cherish every day we're granted together. I promise to build a home and a life with you founded on respect, honesty, and unwavering love. These hands," he lifted her scarred hands to his lips, kissing them gently, "have endured more than most will ever know, yet still have the capacity for tenderness. I am humbled and blessed that you've chosen to share them and your heart with me." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Zachary," she began, her voice wavering slightly before growing stronger, "you found me when I was lost, not just physically but in spirit. You saw beyond my scars to the woman beneath, and in doing so, helped me see myself again. I promise to walk beside you as your equal partner, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, to face whatever challenges come our way with the courage you've taught me to recognize in myself. I promise to love you faithfully and completely for all the days of our lives." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not just a marriage but a journey of healing and hope that many had witnessed firsthand. The wedding celebrations spilled out of the church and into the town, with tables set up in the street and music playing long into the evening. Mrs. Sullivan, resplendent in a new purple dress, cried happy tears as she hugged both bride and groom. "I knew from the start you two were meant for each other," she declared, patting Zachary's cheek affectionately. As twilight descended, Zachary led Josephine away from the festivities toward their new home, a house on the edge of town that they had spent the winter renovating together. It was modest but solid, with a wide porch, large windows, and enough room for the family they both hoped to have. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackburn," Zachary said, sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, with a fire already lit in the hearth and fresh flowers on the table, undoubtedly Mrs. Sullivan's doing. Zachary set Josephine gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist, unwilling to break contact. "Are you happy?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Josephine reached up to cup his face, her scarred hands against his skin, a touch that once would have filled her with shame but now felt natural and right. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him. "Are you?" His answer was to kiss her, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all his love and desire into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I have everything I could ever want right here in my arms." Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Josephine faced a moment of vulnerability as Zachary helped her remove her wedding dress. The scars on her hands were familiar to him, but there were others on her back, her shoulders, her arms that she had kept hidden until now. "Josephine," Zachary breathed, seeing the full extent of the marks for the first time. His expression held no disgust, only a deep sadness mixed with reverence. "My brave, beautiful wife." With infinite tenderness, he bent to kiss a scar that curved along her shoulder, blade the result of a whiplash years ago. "This is courage," he murmured against her skin. He moved to another mark near her elbow. "This is survival." Another kiss, another scar. "This is strength." By the time he had acknowledged each mark with his lips and gentle words, Josephine was trembling not with fear or shame, but with the overwhelming realization that she was truly loved, scars and all. That in Zachary's eyes, these marks weren't disfigurements but badges of honor. When he finally took her in his arms, their union was both a consummation of their marriage and a healing of old wounds. In his embrace, Josephine found not just pleasure but redemption, the final reclaiming of a body that had endured so much pain, now experiencing the ultimate joy of loving and being loved. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Zachary's fingers traced lazy patterns on her skin, connecting her scars like stars in a constellation. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I will spend every day of our life together ensuring that these are the last scars you'll ever bear from cruelty." Josephine nestled closer to him, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I believe you," she whispered. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt completely safe, completely whole, completely at peace. The years that followed brought more joy than Josephine could have imagined during her darkest days. Her work with Mrs. Winters evolved into a partnership, with Josephine taking on more responsibility as the older woman's eyesight began to fail. Eventually, they renamed the shop Winters and Blackburn Fine Apparel, and Josephine found fulfillment in creating beautiful garments for the women of Hecla and surrounding communities. Zachary continued as sheriff, his fair-minded approach to justice earning him respect throughout the territory. He was offered positions in larger towns more than once, but always declined, preferring to remain in Hecla, where he and Josephine had built their life together. Their family grew with the birth of their son, William. In the spring of 1880, a robust baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. 2 years later, they welcomed twin girls, Elizabeth and Sarah, whose arrival nearly overwhelmed them until Mrs. Sullivan moved in temporarily to help. 3 children under 3, Zachary had remarked one evening, watching Josephine nurse one of the twins while the other slept in a cradle nearby. We certainly don't do things by halves, do we? Would you have it any other way? She'd asked, looking up at him with tired but happy eyes. His answer had been to kiss her forehead gently. Not for all the gold in Montana. As the children grew, Josephine made no attempt to hide her scarred hands from them. When William was old enough to ask about them, she explained in simple terms that she had been hurt a long time ago but was better now. "Does it still hurt, Mama?" he'd asked, his small fingers tracing the marks with innocent curiosity. "No, sweetheart," she'd assured him. "They're just reminders of a time that's past." The twins were less interested in the scars themselves, and more fascinated by the stories Josephine could tell with her hands shadow puppets cast on the wall by lamplight, intricate cat's cradles formed with string, and the graceful movements that accompanied bedtime tales. On a warm autumn day in 1885, as Josephine sat on their porch watching the children play in the yard, she reflected on how far she had come. At 30, she had a thriving business, a loving husband, healthy children, and a place in a community that had embraced her despite or perhaps because of her past. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Zachary rode into view, returning from his daily patrol. Even after 6 years of marriage, the sight of him still caused her heart to quicken. He dismounted with the easy grace that had first caught her attention, secured his horse, and made his way to the porch. "How are my favorite people today?" he asked, bending to kiss her before the children noticed his arrival and came running. "Papa's home," William shouted, leading the charge with his sisters close behind. Zachary scooped up all three in a bear hug, their laughter ringing out in the clear mountain air. Josephine watched, a contentment so deep it was almost painful filling her chest. This was what happiness felt like, not the absence of pain or the erasing of scars, but the creation of joy despite them. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Zachary and Josephine sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him, their bodies fitting together with the easy familiarity of longtime lovers. "I had a letter from the U.S. Marshal today," Zachary said, breaking the comfortable silence. "James Harrington died in prison last week." Josephine absorbed the news, surprised by her lack of strong reaction. "I hope he found peace before the end," she said finally. Zachary tightened his arm around her. "That's a generous sentiment, considering what he did to you. Hatred is too heavy a burden to carry, especially when life has given me so much to be thankful for." She turned to look at him, the man who had helped her find her way back to herself. "You taught me that, that the past doesn't have to poison the present," he smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "You always had that wisdom in you. I just reminded you it was there." Josephine lifted her hand to his cheek, the scars pale in the moonlight. "Do you remember what you said about my hands the first time you saw them? That first day in the general store?" "I said they told the story of your courage," he recalled, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "And I've never seen anything to change my mind about that." "I didn't believe you then," she admitted. "I couldn't see beyond the ugliness of how they looked." And now, Josephine looked at her hands, the same scars, the same marks, but viewed through entirely different eyes. "Now I see what you saw, not just scars, but survival. Not just pain endured, but strength discovered." She smiled, both at him and at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Now I see courage." Zachary drew her closer, his kiss a testament to years of love and commitment. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Josephine Blackburn. And I thank God every day that you had the courage to trust me with your heart." As they sat together beneath the vast Montana sky, the house behind them filled with sleeping children and the promise of tomorrow, Josephine knew with bone-deep certainty that her scars, both physical and emotional, had led her here, to this life, this love, this moment of perfect peace. They were no longer marks of shame, but badges of survival. Not reminders of what she had lost, but guideposts to what she had found. And in Zachary's eyes, in his touch, in his unwavering belief in her strength, those scars had been transformed from symbols of pain into emblems of courage. That transformation, Josephine realized, was the greatest love story of all.